Hey friends, Jerry Robinson here from True Riches Academy and also online at truerichesradio.com. I want to just follow up on a recent video that I had done on the topic of the famines that are obviously coming as a result of the coronavirus, which is striking the world with a vengeance right now. Big pandemic, a big plague that is making its way around the globe. Many third world nations have yet to be touched by this pandemic, but it appears they're going to be hit very hard, like many of the developed countries have. Here in the United States, we've seen the pretty much the biggest fallout from the coronavirus thus far. It's difficult to know what lies ahead, but so far, the United States leads the world in both reported coronavirus cases and also in deaths. And this morning, as I was kind of digesting some of this information, I was thinking of an old book that I had read many years ago. It sits on my bookshelf. In fact, I turned back to it and I pulled a few quotes out I want to share with you. This is a book by Ruth Block. It's an academic book. It's a little bit of a dry read, but I'll just give you just a real small snippet of some of the things that are in it in case you're interested. The book is called Visionary Republic: Millennial Themes in American Thought, 1756 to 1800. The reason why my mind went back to this book this morning was because I was reading some different things about how it appears that here in the United States, many evangelical Christians have sided with President Trump in believing that the coronavirus is not as dangerous as it may seem. Also, that perhaps we should reopen the economy very quickly. And also, but most disturbingly, pointing to the science that is talking about this pandemic and also calling it a hoax. Now, I realize that not all evangelicals are calling the coronavirus a hoax. I realize that. But I do know that many are. And I do know that many also have continually torn down the forecast and predictions put forth by scientists who have tried to warn the world about this coronavirus and the danger that it poses, as many people are now dead. I guess well over 200,000 now are dead. And that number, of course, is probably inaccurate. It's probably much higher, as no nation has it in their best interest to report the actual number, as it would make them look worse than perhaps other nations. And so here, as I think about this, with the evangelicals largely protesting against science, both science in declaring the coming of the climate change. We've heard about this, of course, that humans are involved in through their actions, through industry and things like that, pollution, and through just simple fossil fuel, abuse and exploitation. We have led now to a place where we're facing, man-made climate change. That's the claim of scientists. And of course, their predictions are pretty gloomy. When you look out a few decades, you'll see that they don't predict too many good things for America or other nations as well, especially third world nations that are a bit more vulnerable. Now, what I find interesting about evangelicals calling the coronavirus a hoax and calling scientists inaccurate with their predictions is the fact that the United States, here in the United States, for example, evangelicals for centuries have been making false and wild predictions based upon their book. And yet they also need to realize that they get to be held to account as well. The book Visionary Republic by Ruth Block, let me just read you a couple of quotes here from this book. This says, "In patriot sermons and poetry, Britain was cast in the role of the persecuting dragon of the book of Revelation, and America portrayed as the woman in the wilderness who escapes and gives birth to a heroic son. The symbol of the man-child represented America's faithful and pious freeman, preserved in infancy from the devouring dragon of arbitrary power." So at the time of the American Revolution, there was a belief that the Antichrist was the King George III, And in fact, the Antichrist forces were King George III's military forces, the forces of Britain, as they came and they tried to corral a very rowdy and rebellious group of colonists that were demanding freedom from the king, who wanted to overthrow the monarchy. And during this time, the early Christians, many of them had identified the Pope as the Antichrist and the Roman Catholic Church as the church, of the Antichrist. Today, not so much. Today, it's difficult to get an evangelical to actually admit that they think Catholics are Antichrist, making it one of the greatest scandals of all time. The fact that evangelical Christians, Protestant Christians, turn their guns and weapons upon their Catholic brothers and sisters because they believe them to be Antichrist and the Pope to be Antichrist. And yet today that seems to have diminished, and yet the separation, the schism still exists, making it an incredible scandal that really has very few answers today as to why that schism would remain. After the allegations and accusations no longer seem to stick against the Catholic Church. Well, the same case in Britain. It's ironic that the United States and the UK get along today or consider themselves allies, considering that the patriots, quote unquote, the American patriots, believe that Britain was the Antichrist force. Let's take a look here at another passage here from this book. The image of British tyranny as the Antichrist, for example, which had first appeared in the anonymous literature of the Stamp Act crisis, received even more elaboration after the conflict with Britain broke into war. Earlier, an expression of popular radicalism, this association of Great Britain with the devil had already gained increased respectability among colonial Protestants with the Quebec Act of 1774, which firmly identified the London government with the popish beast. Once the bloodshed began, the influence of Rome no longer remained crucial to this symbolic connection. The British alone became the target of extreme vilification as the agents of the Antichrist. The patriot clergy and laity of varying degrees of religious orthodoxy repeatedly described the American patriot forces as the soldiers of Christ, doing heroic battle against all the powers of hell, the prince of darkness, the serpent, the dragon, the anti-Christian beast of biblical prophecy. Again, so this concept that was wrapped around the revolution that really didn't quite make it into your history books is preserved by this book written by Ruth Block, a wonderful book to have on your bookshelf for those who are interested in American history, early American history, that goes back and examines all of the millennial literature that was written during the time of the American Revolution, and points out, what Protestants were thinking. What were they thinking as they were, literally picking up arms and shooting their fellow Christians from Britain? These people were from the Church of England, and of course, many Americans were from the Church of England, and yet they were shooting each other. How do you square that? How do you square that? That doesn't make much sense, especially when both were claiming to be Christian. And one way that you can certainly get a Christian to shoot another Christian is to tell them, of course, that they're Antichrist, that they represent Antichrist forces, and that their leader is the Antichrist. So this notion that that we have an Antichrist and we need to fight against the Antichrist, goes back much even further back before the American Revolution. But we're talking here in terms of just simply America in this quick video. And then let me show you another little excerpt here. So intense were these millennial expectations during the early years of the Revolutionary War that numerous patriots foresaw the final destruction of Antichrist and the establishment of the kingdom of God within the immediate future. So this was a great belief early on among some of America's Protestant groups that once the war was won, that the millennial reign would begin, and that this was actually the overthrow of the Antichrist. And so you can see that many of these, early American colonial Protestants were fighting, perhaps in good faith, underneath the orders of their clergy or underneath the orders of the state, which blended with the clergy quite a bit during these times. And in essence, they believed themselves to be taking up arms against the Antichrist forces, when in reality they were shooting their own Christian brothers or their own Christian sisters, or whatever the case might be. We know there's tremendous amount of bloodshed that went on during this time. And of course, these same forces would be asserted during the Civil War. We won't have time to get into that now, but of course, the Civil War had very similar elements where the South and the North were fighting for God. God was on both of their sides, and so they were shooting each other. They were both part of a Christian nation, and they were shooting each other to end slavery. The only nation, by the way, in the whole world that actually had to go to a civil war to end slavery. Pretty devastating. So when we look back and we see the failed Antichrist predictions, of course, here's a picture of George III, King George III. If you do an honest rendering of this man through history, you'll discover that he was, at best, maybe a little mentally unstable toward the end. In fact, certainly mentally unstable toward the end, but in no way an Antichrist of any kind. In fact, the kind of power wielded by George III would be laughed at by a modern-day president today. Today's American presidents have more power than any king of old times could. No king in the world could possibly track you wherever you went, listen to every phone call you make, spy upon you, through drones. I mean, it's incredible the kind of power that the American president has today. And so to look back at King George III and accuse him of some sort of draconian Antichrist power, of course, now is ludicrous. But at the time, it helped men raise the guns and point at their Christian brothers, and so it was expedient. Additionally, we've had more recent Antichrist claims. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, during the time of the Great Depression and then the New Deal, there was a tremendous amount of angst about how FDR was so popular amongst the people who were poor and who needed help and who needed Social Security and a social safety net. And of course, businesses were outraged that they were going to have to participate in seeing the people actually receive money instead of themselves actually being the only recipient of government bailouts. And so this became a problem. And FDR, of course, was labeled as an antichrist by many Protestant groups. That was a failure. And then even as late as 2016, we had evangelical Protestants here in the United States telling us that President Barack Obama, was the Antichrist. I spoke at many prophecy conferences over the last decade, and I can tell you that during my time there, I was always in the minority for not believing that President Barack Obama was the Antichrist. Right? That just never really rang true with me. It didn't make any sense, especially from what I've read and my understanding of prophecy. So, but nevertheless, that didn't prevent books being put out. And the people who put books out to that effect are still out putting out books. They're still talking and now labeling someone else as Antichrist. So I think the greatest point I want to make in this brief video here is simply the fact that evangelicals have gotten so many things wrong when it comes to declaring the end of the world, right? Everybody knows that. Evangelicals have blown it. I mean, every single year we have a new book telling us why this year is the year that the world is going to end. We even had back in 2016 a book that said the whole entire economy was going to collapse on the Shemitah, right? September 13th, 2016. Wasn't that the year? Wasn't that the date? During President Barack Obama's presidency, right? But those books now are suddenly gone, right? It's ironic that many evangelicals don't see anything prophetic suddenly about the coronavirus striking during President Trump's tenure in office. It's very, very telling. And the other thing also is that their accusations about certain different people being Antichrist have been hollow and wrong, right? So we know this. Going back through time, we know that these have proven to be untrue. And so it would seem that the evangelical who has made so many false claims, so many inaccurate predictions and forecasts about the end of the world and about the Antichrist, literally, calling our own presidents Antichrists when it's convenient, now have the gall. They have the gall to point at the scientist and call the scientist a fearmonger for looking at math and data. So just a simple observation, just to leave you with, that how incredible that the evangelical, who has got so many things wrong on the end of days, so many people wrong about the Antichrist, and has led to much bloodshed because of that, actually calls the scientist, who sees what's coming through math and through science and data, and even though it confirms the very writings of the book of Revelation, even though the scientist says it looks like the sun is going to get hotter, and the Bible tells us that the sun will scorch men's skin. And then it tells us that we're going to have pandemics and droughts. We still have evangelicals telling us that these pandemics are hoaxes. And then we hear that there's going to be tremendous violent types of natural phenomena and weather disasters. And yet this is exactly what the scientist says he sees whenever he looks at his data and his math and does his forecasts and models. So it simply is incredible that in this current era, where we have so much being said wrong from the evangelical about Antichrist and end of the world, that they would actually have the gall to point at the scientists who are confirming what their own Bible says. And instead of actually using that and saying, look, our Bible is being proven by the scientists themselves, they instead call the scientists alarmists and claim that they are actually hoaxes, while they themselves, the evangelicals themselves, sit upon atop of an enormous number of hoaxes in the form of all of the wrong Antichrist predictions and all of the faulty end of days predictions and books and prophecies that they have put out. Just a little food for thought for you again today. My name is Jerry Robinson, TrueRichesRadio.com if you want to learn more, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel for more provocative videos like this one. Simply click on the subscribe button and the bell to be notified when we provide another video. God bless.